All right, this is Ricky,
And this is Brendan.
and you're listening to A Gentleman's Disagreement.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though we did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.
All right, Brendan, it is Thursday, May 15th. It's been a little bit since we last recorded. I was away on a little bit of a family vacation.
Oh, no way. No way. You were away.
You know what's it?
Yeah.
Yeah, when we told the daycare like, hey, Millie's not going to be back for a couple of days. The woman there was like, take me with you. Your family goes on vacation a lot. And I was like, I guess we have done a handful of these over the past couple of
No, I
months.
will say I was having this conversation recently with a bunch of people about like how many states out of the 50 you've been to. And so we're all kind of counting our states. And to be fair to you, you kind of go to the same places over and over. So I don't know how many new states you're hitting. I don't know how long you've been down to South Carolina before. Probably have. Uh, but yeah, your travels. You've been a lot of places.
Yeah, I mean I do have quite a bit of like the between the Midwest and the West. Call it the Mountain West, but I guess there's like some other areas in there that are lacking in my US state visit portfolio, but I've hit quite a few. Anyways, on this trip, we were down in South Carolina in search of a warmer climate. And I don't know, I guess that brings me to our guest today.
I see what you did there, Ricky. Well done. So we're talking to Dr. Joseph B. Keller today. Uh, Joe, I'll give him obviously a bigger bio when he comes on, but is not a resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. And while he has a variety of interests and his like background educationally and professionally, he's worked on a bunch of different areas, which is really cool. In terms of how I came across him. He's really at the forefront of this intersection between artificial intelligence, AI, and climate change and what that means. So in the kind of like connector in there is energy. So AI, energy uses, climate change, how all of those things fit together. It's something, Ricky, that I've been wanting to talk about for a while, actually, which is funny given that you are the one that works in this space. But for me, it's something where it feels like no one is talking about it. That may or may not be true. We'll see what Joe has to tell us about that. But I I don't feel like it's talked about together. I'll reference this when Joe comes on because I think it's really interesting. It's 2 years ago when we did our like end of year top story of the year 2023. Number five for you was COP28, like the climate change accords, and number four for you was the rise of AI. You also put the rise of AI at number four last year, so at least you're consistent about that. We can look forward. We can just pencil that in for 2025, the rise of AI. But that to me is exactly we're kind of talking about these things independently and in silos. So I want to talk about them together. I came across an article that Dr. Keller wrote, and I reached out to him to see if he could come on, and he generously agreed to do that. So I'm really excited. I feel like I I'm hopefully going to get some of my questions answered.
Yeah, I mean the I mean thanks for outing me there. I think I'll still probably put it at somewhere three or four, so folks can stay tuned for that at the end of this year. But as the evolution of AI is happening at a breakneck pace, feels like right now. So this is a very timely conversation, and I am very much looking forward to it.
Perfect. Let's bring him on to have it. All right, we're now really excited to welcome Joseph B. Keller onto the program. Joe is a non-resident fellow with the Artificial Intelligence and Emerging Technologies Initiative at Brookings. His research interests include global governance strategies for machine learning and artificial intelligence, policy implications for emerging technologies in the global south, and the geopolitical consequences of climate change, which is exactly what we want to talk about. Previously, Joe was a senior director of congressional and federal relations for the American Psychological Association, where he managed a portfolio of legislative and executive branch policy issue areas, including climate change, artificial intelligence, and the future of work. Prior to that, he served as a science and technology policy fellow at the U.S. Natural Science Foundation for the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Joe has received a bachelor in biological sciences from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, a master's in computational neuroscience from Boston University, and a doctorate in cognitive science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. While all of those sound incredibly difficult, incredibly impressive, most importantly for us as a Massachusetts-based podcast is you've been up here in Boston for a little while. So hopefully we can return you to your roots a little bit. But Joe, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me. I do miss it up there. I spent a good deal of my time, and so I think about it often.
We haven't gone far, Ricky and I, and so we love it. We're fierce advocates for it, and we're glad that you got to experience it for a little bit. So I guess I want to start by zooming out big picture, where these last couple of years we've been talking about the rise of AI. One of the episodes Ricky and I do perennially is we list like the biggest stories of the year at the end of every year. And the last 2 years, I have on the top 5 stories on Ricky's list has been the rise of AI. So it's something that we've been talking about, but we haven't necessarily been talking about AI in the context of energy. We've more been talking about like kind of the exciting advances that AI has for us in terms of moving our society forward. And if we've been talking about the negative aspects of AI at all, it's more been like, are they going to take our jobs? Right? Are they replacing us? Or these kind of sci-fi down the road, are we gonna have to contend with like sentient AI? Like those are, I feel like, the fears that I've been hearing. So can you just make the connection for me as kind of a real novice in this area? How does AI use and consume energy in general? And I guess how does that compare to maybe other machines or other types of things that use energy?
That's a really good question. I'm glad to hear that you've been talking about AI so far. I'd love to hear more about that. But the energy piece is a really good one. And luckily, uh, everyone now is trying to understand this energy and environment issue in real time. So it's a real present discussion. So maybe I'll frame this a little bit and then I'll get into how AI is connected to the environment. So I think this is a really sensitive time to be having a conversation about AI, and I'll use the word climate change because I think it's important. There are a lot of moving parts there, including the fact that if we're talking about the US, there's a new administration. That changes of the administration have implications at the international level related to AI and related to climate change. And ultimately, there's the reaction from industry on how they're moving in the same time. And so, this is the case around the globe. I'm assuming we're talking about the US right now. And so when it comes to the US, we lack a federal climate strategy. And certainly, given the way things are going, this won't change anytime soon. I think we're at this moment where we are collecting an overwhelming amount of data for how we understand the environmental impacts of climate change and how they're worsening. That every year it's getting hotter and hotter. Each year we're hearing about records being broken, last year being the warmest in history, the last 10 years being the warmest in history. The weather is getting more extreme, more unpredictable. We're seeing floods and wildfires, and given policy implications, the US may be backsliding into perhaps one of its most polluted eras. We're going to have increased manufacturing at the same time that we see decreased environmental protection. So I think these two trends are in the wrong direction. And so you talked before about trends. At the same time, I think the US lacks a federal strategy around AI, but we're making real good progress with that. The administration recently asked for a public comment on what they call an AI action plan in order to help the US maintain leadership in AI. And so they have a report they expect to come out this summer. We don't know everything, but what we do know is that the approach is going to center largely around deregulation with the hopes that innovation in science and technology without a lot of guardrails will flourish. And it's also one of the same reasons we're seeing a lot of policy at the state level in the absence of federal policy around AI. So I think this is sort of an inflection point. So that's why I like having this conversation now.
All right,
We have
I
this,
want to hop in here just because
yeah.
you've piqued my interest here a little bit. Where you mentioned that we've been seeing a lot of state level regulation around AI because we haven't had that action on the federal level. I don't know how much you've been paying attention to the one big beautiful bill that is trying to kind of advance through Congress right now. But one of the things that caught my eye, because we have at least a draft of it right now in the House, is that the bill would ban state level regulation of AI for a period of 10 years. I'm, I've only really read the headlines about that, but curious if you know more or what your thoughts are about that.
I think that's a really important point. I think it's representative to reactions from the federal government related to the agency that states have. So, in many ways, the states have increased agency when it comes to setting the agenda and policy around AI and around climate. It could create for a complex system, a patchwork of policies that the US is going to have to try to deal with. You don't want to have one policy in the state of Illinois and another one in Nebraska when it comes to understanding AI, when it comes to understanding climate and the environment. And so, in some ways, it's trying to increase the chances for uniform policies, but also at the same time, it's trying to regain control over where things are going related to policy because there's so much uncertainty up in the air.
That makes a lot of sense. So let's take the pro of that of we don't want the patchwork of state by state regulations, but you know we need something. Otherwise, like you said, it's going to be completely deregulated. And we've seen the pitfalls of that before, maybe most notably in at least in our era with around social media. So you were kind of talking previously about they were soliciting public comment on this potential AI platform they're putting forward. What might that look like?
So I think we don't know yet. They are accepting comments and collating them, and we're going to see a report out soon. But some of the comments and submissions from industry, from civil society, from academia have come out. There's a variety of interests that people are trying to represent. Some of them are largely trying to make sure that there are sufficient guardrails and protections around the harmful impacts of AI when it comes to policy and research and development. The administration has taken a very strong stance in trying to shepherd investments into AI. We've seen the example, the very early days of the Trump administration, something called Stargate, which was a project that was already happening, including OpenAI and SoftBank, but one that emphasizes the central role that digital infrastructure, things like data centers, are going to take in this new administration when it comes to AI policy. So one of the things we're going to see, and you talked about it, are ways that emphasize and prioritize access to increased energy, because we're expecting that increases in research and development around AI, specifically generative AI, are going to be complemented without sufficient access to energy. We have this bottleneck here. And because we're talking about different sources of energy, we're talking about renewable, nuclear, of course, fossil fuels, policy around climate has sort of narrowed the option of choices that we have, where there is increased drill, baby, drill, perhaps, approach to tying fossil fuel infrastructure with the increased AI proliferation. And so what people are going to have to sort out with policy is how do you increase access to energy resources in a way that help increase leadership for the US and AI, but also stay in line with administration policy about picking and choosing the energy sources. So for example, not just fossil fuels, nuclear energy has been noted as a potential option for the future. And so that's an exciting new frontier for folks to explore.
That is an exciting new frontier. We had an episode on that a couple months ago about the potential, like the promise of nuclear energy, and I left more excited than ever about that possibility, although slightly frustrated that I'm not sure that my energy and excitement for nuclear was being seen across most of our society. But to put that aside for at least a minute, you write, I'm going to reference this article that you wrote in January of 2024. The title of it was "The U.S. Must Balance Climate Justice Challenges in the Era of Artificial Intelligence." You wrote it you co-authored it with a couple of your colleagues, and I'll reference it throughout throughout our conversation here, but one piece from it you write is, quote, generative models with broad functionality such as Bard or ChatGPT employ far more power per query than conventional applications. And later on, the more we ask models to perform wide-ranging tasks, the greater the amount of energy and carbon necessary. So again, for someone like me that doesn't really understand that, like, what does that mean? Why do these models require such great inputs of energy?
Right. I think there is a very clear connection between what we consider AI, which inherently seems intangible. Things are in the cloud, they're not tethered to things on the ground. But AI has this very real and tangible manifestation in the world. We see it in the form of fiber optic cables, we see it in the form of data centers, and those are the things to consider when it comes to the environment, as well as the inputs and the components for that. So, the inputs and outputs of AI have to do with trying to account for the supply chain throughout the life cycle. They include things like energy consumption during training of a model, for example, around AI, have to do with the energy expended to deploy it, what's called inference. When you use your large language model in your chatbot, that's called inference. There are carbon emissions associated with each one of those activities. And we're at a moment where we see a couple of things happen. One is that there is a new emergence of models that perhaps are smaller and sleeker and more efficient. So there's a large body of conversation that talks about having models that are more specific to tasks, and perhaps that makes them more efficient in their use. But I think there's a larger trend that these models are getting larger and larger, and therefore the more components, the complexity, the functionality they have, the more energy it takes to make them do what they do. And I think that is the larger trend we're going to continue to see, especially as what people have called multimodal things happen. You have text creation, which takes a certain amount of energy. You have creating images, which takes a larger amount of energy. People are creating videos and creating sounds. And the more that we're able to mix and match the different types of outputs when it comes to generative AI, the more we're going to see it tap into energy.
I guess, this is sort of the challenge that AI is growing and has an ever increasing, maybe exponentially growing energy need. What are the types of policy prescriptions that you think are sort of necessary for guiding AI to move forward in a sustainable way? Or is there a way to do it?
Yeah, I think that is the $64,000 question. I think we're at an uncertain point when it comes to deciding what's sustainable. I think there are policy projections that talk about making sure that we remove all the protections that prohibit us from getting the energy we need to maintain dominance in AI for the US. And I think that's really important because we have a bottleneck. I also think that the aperture of options when it comes to energy needs to be expanded, because at this moment, we are largely going to ignore the opportunities that are coming from renewable energies. And I think there was a survey a few weeks ago from the Financial Times. It asked anonymously to executives of North American big tech companies. And largely what they said was, yes, we are in line with policy solutions that help reduce the regulatory burden on the products that we're trying to create. At the same time, they recognize there's a trend going in one direction that the current years are not going to stop. So in a longer time horizon, there are many more positives I think that they see with the transition to renewables eventually than maintaining focus on access to fossil fuels, for example, in the moment. So I think it's going to be trying to create a diverse array of options. And so maximizing those options, I think, will lead to more sustainable access to energy for AI.
So, Ricky, I'm not going to cut you off here, but I think in some ways what you're saying, Joe, and correct me if I'm wrong, like that mirrors a little bit of what you're hearing from the Trump administration, even the Senator, like what we used to have with Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, who used to say, like, we want to increase our energy in all aspects. So whether that's having drill baby drill and getting more natural gas, or if it's more fracking, or let's increase our solar energy and our wind energy. Let's do more of all of that. But that's great. Say we do all of that. We're increasing our energy output as a nation, and there's lots of benefits to that. But if you're thinking about AI in particular, AI's the energy AI is using is not going to decrease, at least in the near future, right? Like AI is just really at the beginning. We know whenever we have these new technologies, these new industries, they consume the most energy really at the beginning. And AI, as it advances, like you're saying, in what it's able to do, it's going to create more energy, going to need more energy. So in some ways, what it looks like to me is even if we are adding more renewable energies into our kind of our pie of the amount of the energy that we use, that energy, the additional energy that we have access to as a country is going to be almost consumed because we need more energy because of the rise of AI. So to me, that's not necessarily an improvement. It's just we've created more energy, but we're also using more energy. We're not making any transition, if that's what you want to do to begin with, from fossil fuels into renewable energies. Like, does that are you seeing the same thing? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And you've highlighted one thing that you see not only potentially on the horizon for AI, but also one that mirrors what happens in industrial shifts. We understand that much of the technology is going to be advanced. There was recently a report from the International Energy Agency, and it talked about uh, AI and energy. And it highlighted mostly, it was a very long report, you should read it, but it highlighted mostly the fact that AI in the future has the potential to help target issues around climate change and has the potential to help access and unlock additional energy sources. So using AI to make AI more sustainable in the future. And I think there's a lot of relevance to that. I think it's important that AI be used to try to make sure that it's more sustainable. But the same way that it's a solution, I think it's also a challenge and a problem. And so when we see advances, perhaps in efficiency, that are unlocked by AI, they give us new tools to use. We also could see the idea that when something's more usable, more efficient, it's also perhaps going to be used more often. And so this is where you have this trade-off. Some economists have called this Jevons paradox, and it's the idea that if AI is going to drive more resource consumption, you may see increases in things like emissions. But even if you see decreases in efficiency, decreases in electricity use because of efficiency, and we've seen that largely in Western places like the US, that electricity overall has decreased because of efficiency and advances in technology. That because there's advanced consumption, you're going to erode those advances that you've seen, those gains that you've made. And so you have to think about which trend is moving faster. And I think that presents a problem that you talked about, that despite the gains that we have, we still tend to see an overall increase in consumption because demand keeps going up faster than efficiency.
I think that's a really interesting question, and this area I'm also woefully not sort of prepared to speak intelligently about, but I'm wondering if you've heard anything about it. So the DeepSeek sort of kind of phenomenon, right, happened, I think, last year at some point where all of a sudden it appears that some type of AI kind of model can do a very similar thing to some of these far more energy intensive models. I'm curious, like, what you've read and or heard or understand about it relative to some of the alternatives, and also just in thinking about how we have to make decisions from an energy perspective, right? Energy generating units are typically very long-term investments. And as you said, our load growth, at least here in the United States, because of efficiency and other technological advancements, has been historically flat last 10 years, let's call it. Now we're projecting a ton of growth, but a large part on the backs of this idea that AI is just going to continue to add to that. Yeah, I guess, have you heard of it? Is that sort of a complicating factor in terms of thinking about how do we make this transition for demand that is potentially obsolete if we end up with something far more efficient?
I think that's a great point, and I would say both yes and no. As far as I understand, when you're talking about efficiency, you talked about this company DeepSeek from China. Recently, they created this model called R1, and it shocked the landscape of AI just because of its both capability and functionality, that it was really good at doing what a lot of larger models are doing, but also the fact that it was smaller, more efficient. And VCs saw it and they said, well, this is much, much cheaper. How does this justify the grand investments we're making? Because there was the general consensus that you need to flood the sector with money because scale is really the solution. But I think what we've largely seen, and some of that has to do with geography. So that took place in China, and so China has its own challenges when it comes to creating infrastructure to support their own sustainability over time and scaling. Reports have shown that they have built lots and lots of data centers, but it's not clear that they're being used, in part because there's this very delicate balance between the government and industry, which largely the government has control over industry operations, but certainly not in the way that those things are happening in the US. So that still remains a very potential important opportunity. Many companies see that still as a North Star to create these models that are improved for efficiency. They're smaller, they're sleeker, but still just as impactful. But I think what I was mentioning before, and there was a recent report from the Stanford AI Center, and it talked about these trends. And so we have seen, 2024 may have been called the year of AI efficiency, sort of these sleeker models, but largely the bigger players, the more established players, are still seeing this as a scaling game. They're still putting more and more resources behind bigger and bigger models that can do more and more things. So I think we may still see these notable touch points, but perhaps they may be rare events in this larger trend of bigger and bigger, more complex models that don't have the efficiency that everyone's looking at. But your question about growth over time, I think, is a really interesting one, right? Because some of it has to do with geography. Again, considering Western companies, more advanced economies have a lot more efficiency gains with energy than other parts of the world, global majorities or global South, however you'd like to call it. And so AI right now represents a certain portion that stands to increase, but also because electric grids, energy grids will be strained by more and more sources of energy relying on electricity. We are going to see more and more solar arrays, yes, but we're going to see more electric vehicles. And data centers now are going to exist. Not all of them exist for usage for AI, but a greater percentage of their operations will be allocated to AI. And now AI exclusive data centers are being built. So it's going to be an array of things that are going to strain electricity grids in the future. AI doesn't have that large global impact now, but certainly in the next 10 years, lots of projections talk about the exponential way it's going to be a larger portion of digital infrastructure and a larger portion of digital energy consumption. So I think there's a really important part of that we need to pay attention to.
I think the question of, or sort of the point of geography is a really interesting one as well, and maybe something that isn't as discussed. I know it's one of your areas of studies is climate justice, which in many ways is also sort of a recognition of how the impacts of climate change are disparate. I wonder how you're also thinking about that, both in where these data centers and where these AI training models are going to be popping up, but also, yeah, how we should all be thinking about the, I guess, eventual costs of kind of exacerbating climate change as it is.
Joe, I want you to answer that, but Ricky, I just want to hop in here because I think it's really interesting. We're having this conversation today on May 25th, and in the last 2 days, there was an article that came out just yesterday on May 24th about two data centers that Elon Musk is building. One is in Atlanta and one is in South Memphis. And then there's one that came out just today on May 15th about one that Meta is building in Louisiana. And these data centers, I think Joe, you kind of alluded to it, they're massive. So you need to put them somewhere. And if you look at where they're being put, the article I was reading about Musk in South Memphis was saying this is already the area in the state that has the highest percentage of people with asthma, for example. And I'm not going to pretend to know where in Atlanta the other one's going or where in Louisiana this one's going, but uh, we're seeing kind of what communities are allowing these data centers to kind of be in their backyard. And we know that we're only getting more and more of them. So I just want to kind of add some context and specific examples to Ricky's question, Joe, but I'll let you take it from here.
No, I really appreciate how you connected both of those issues. I think to tackle the first topic um, from the start, I think about environmental justice just with the idea that with climate change, there's not an equal distribution of negative burdens in society. It's based on where people live, it's based on what benefits they get from government, it's based on how the environment reflects industrial change and how that impacts communities largely, but also individuals. And so we, in our research, tried to identify one aspect of that, which is the climate justice aspect of trying to connect justice-based approaches with environment to social equity. We were trying to argue that if you think about the development of AI and the negative impacts of climate change, they're going to largely follow historical patterns where the most marginalized communities perhaps bear the disproportionate burdens, and expecting as well that they're going to be compounded with each other, and that the data center story is really kind of the most illustrative part of this. You know, people are putting data centers in places where a lot of water is needed to run them. Water is needed to cool largely servers that get way too hot inside the data centers. And so they're put in places like Arizona, for example, places that are already water scarce, or they're placed in places that need a lot of energy, but that the energy they need, because they don't have access to renewables, so the energy is going to require tapping into more fossil fuels. These are often located in proximity to disadvantaged communities. So, you know, some people have to deal with the environmental manifestation of AI, and others do not. So I think it's important to have this in mind as we create sort of policy. Talking about data centers and Elon Musk and xAI, the Memphis example is perhaps the present day example of that. There's something called the Memphis Coalition Against Pollution. You're having a moment where every time you're going to see a data center erected, you're going to see pushback from the community. Here in Virginia is the largest concentration of data centers in the world. There's about 150 or more of them in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so for years in local politics, you've seen issues around policy come up. The most recent example is that a bill brought to Governor Youngkin was vetoed, and it was going to provide greater protections for taxpayers in the area. People are complaining about noise pollution, that things are unsightly, but also they brought in utilities. So there are very real ways to note these changes. Dominion Energy, which is a Virginia utility, talked about creating new classes of users based on consumption. This I see as an indirect reference to the fact that data center companies are going to be some of their biggest users, and trying to create policies that lock them into longer term deals in ways that don't lead to more blackouts and don't lead to increases in the financial cost for the rest of the taxpayers that are paying for grids that can't support the greater use. So going from Virginia back to Memphis, people are talking about asthma. People are talking about access to potable water. And the more often we're going to see these buildings come up, I think the more often we're going to see these stories about how communities are understanding what's happening around them and acknowledging the different ways that they're feeling the negative impacts of this industrialization. And so just lastly, on the data center for Elon Musk, there's a data center called Colossus there, which at the moment was supporting what was considered to be the largest supercomputer, most advanced supercomputer in the country. Colossus supports xAI and Grok and all those models on the X platform. Even given all those advances, as far as I understand, Colossus, the data center runs on diesel fuel. So there's this mismatch still in all different ways, combining the most advanced products regarding technology. You still have to try to match those with the same amount of advancement when it comes to energy sources.
So looking to the future of these, and like I think we all acknowledge that data centers are going to continue to proliferate because as not only these companies that are already at the head of the field get bigger, but more companies kind of enter the space because so much money is there, right? It's something like an $8 trillion a year industry, which I only expect to grow. But what the articles at least I've been reading, there was I think an op-ed in the New York Times recently where kind of highlighting some of the things that you're talking about, Joe, and saying that residents often don't know until it's too late. Like there's like non-disclosure agreements that are happening, and all of a sudden you're just kind of like, oh, there's a factory that's being, or there's a data center that's being built. You don't really know what that means because people have real lives and real concerns, and they're not really necessarily worried about that. But then you hear the noise pollution maybe is one of the things I feel like that has come up where people are surprised by it. And like, what is that? And like, oh, that's the new data center. But by then it's too late. So I think now we're kind of back to where we started in a lot of ways, where these are kind of local problems, but they're local problems that are happening across the country. So is there a role for the federal government here? And if so, what might that role be?
Yeah, I think highlighting the local versus global is really interesting in one way because thinking about carbon emissions, greenhouse gases that are created from industry, people have solutions around carbon offsets or planting a lot of trees somewhere. And these are potential solutions, but it's also unclear how you do the accounting. I think the accounting is really where the important part lies. But when you're considering, for example, something like water, access to water or limited water resources are certainly local issues. If you're tapping or exacerbating uh, water scarcity in one region, it cannot be solved by providing water in another. So I think these solutions are going to have to include federal governments or local governments considering geography. I think the government does have a role to play, of course. I think that, you know, governments can incentivize sustainability. They can provide credits, they can provide carrots as opposed to sticks. They can help to try to enforce transparency. Many times, right now, the data regarding where data centers are going, the fact that they are being placed in places where there are fossil fuels, perhaps as energy sources, or the water is scarce. That data is not really accessible. Trying to increase transparency about the measures and then using that data to help inform the policies you create. And then one way people thought about is regulate based on usage. I know that local utilities are considering that as well. From a broader landscape, I think approaches to policy, creating regulations versus not having regulations, from a climate justice standpoint, I think it's important to try to integrate environmental justice into AI governance. I think that's important. If you're able to create standardized methodology for trying to assess how we understand environmental impacts, I think that's also important. There are other examples out there. The OECD has a framework to use. Largely, member states of the European Union are doing that, trying to understand how can we measure and then perhaps tax the usage, or using that data to inform how we approach policy. But when you talked about communities, I think one of the most important part is how do you integrate the people who are most impacted by this? One aspect of that is jobs, the economy. There's the proposal that many of these projects will include increased green jobs, if you're not considering green, or just jobs that are driven by AI products in the real world. Making sure that access to those jobs go to the communities that need them most. If they're in the community, bring those communities in. And the last part of that also assumes that those communities know what's going on, that you mentioned, Brendan, and that they feel like they have some agency to use their voice in the conversation. And I think those fora where you can have discussions and where all stakeholders are given a chance to share their mind, I think those aren't provided with nearly enough frequency.
All great points. I want to quote how you ended the piece that I've referenced repeatedly, and a quote, "We must embed justice and fairness at the core of our innovations, particularly in AI. If not properly managed, these colliding forces could exacerbate social inequalities and threaten equitable and sustainable transitions. The stakes of climate change are grave, and as tech investments accelerate the next chapter in AI, they must align with U.S. ambitions for sustainability." And I would encourage anyone to go read the piece. You can just look it up, Joseph B. Keller, and the dangers of climate change, the intersection of climate change and AI. But Joe, to kind of wrap it up here, that's very much like a warning at the end of the piece that you had laid out, and you provided potentially some like, policy prescriptions for it, and what you just said. Are you hopeful? What do you if you were in charge here, like what would you hope to see in these next 5 years? And then tell me, do you think that how much of that is a reality?
There's a good reason I'm not in charge, and that's probably we're all probably better off for that. I am hopeful and inspired by the fact that, in writ large, we're understanding more and more about what the environmental impact of AI looks like, what it feels like. We're getting more data. And I'm also inspired by the fact that we've identified that energy is a really critical component of that. For me, that necessitates a conversation, opens the door for us to have a conversation about natural resources, about minerals, about land, about water, about emissions. And so I think inherent in discussions about energy, it does open the door to those things. But I have some concerns. I'm concerned about the fact that the right incentives aren't in place and there are potential challenges before us. So, for example, I mentioned that when Lee Zeldin, the head of the EPA, was nominated early in 2025, he posted on social media that we were going to unleash energy for AI. Already, that was the priority of the Environmental Protection Agency. I think there's a very important part of that conversation that could be included for environmental protections for that jurisdiction of Lee Zeldin. But I also think that is a narrow view, perhaps. And so what I'm hoping is that more stakeholders, I hope we don't have to learn the hard way, I guess. I hope that we can be proactive in thinking about how to do that. We've identified that energy is really critical. I think we're also acknowledged. And the Department of Energy, for example, put out a request for information. They want to try to use federal lands to, I think 16 plots, use federal lands to erect data centers, or at least erect sources of energy. I think we're going to see pushback. And so what I'm hoping for is that there's enough stakeholders that have enough information and data that they can have an informed discussion about what all these things mean. Because I think we all suffer from opacity. And so what I'm hoping for is that we come to the table with information, with data, and with facts, and with the motivation that there are a lot of positive things happening for the US when it comes to AI. And so I think trying to harness energy while also considering the climate, I hope all these things will come in tandem together. So that is my hope.
I think it's a beautiful way to end that. And I appreciate you just being in this space because, like I said originally when I reached out to you and I was talking with Ricky about this, is I feel like these were things were advancing kind of in silos, like the rise of AI and the rise of climate change, and people were kind of talking about both, but not talking about them together. And so once I came across your work that you were doing, I was like, well, someone's talking about this, and I'm sure there are many other people out there, but hopefully we can just, I guess you can keep spreading the word of like the importance of considering this intersection. So along those lines, where if people wanted to follow your work or follow you personally, where might they be able to do that?
They can find me on the Brookings website, where all of my work is posted. Also, ways to contact me for media. I'm also on X, formerly known as Twitter, JBK_PhD. And I need to be better about that. But I think what's really exciting is that the folks that have interest in this intersection of AI in the environment are getting their hands dirty in all the different ways they find. So, for example, someone has created a database, all these resources, environmental resources, um, that have to do with trying to create an informed conversation around AI and the environment. So, because we know more, I think we can do more.
That's a good tagline for anything. That is good. Yeah. All right,
Thank you
Joe.
so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for your time and expertise. That's we really appreciate it.
Thank you both for having me. I really appreciate it.
Huge thanks again to Joe, Dr. Keller, as if you will. He was really exactly who I was looking to talk to about this, and I love the way he ended it, kind of explaining that in some ways. And I guess Ricky, this is why I loved it, because this goes along with our ethos. A lot of the conversations are important, where we just these are this is a new space, this intersection, because AI is a relatively new technology. So people are just now accumulating the data and being able to have kind of authentic, fact-based conversations around the intersection of AI and energy and climate change. So I appreciated that, and hopefully we see more of that. I'm not sure that I'm seeing that necessarily on the federal level. That may be like my blinders too, which is again why I wanted to talk to Joe. But he seemed hopeful that there are a lot of stakeholders in this space that are going to continue to have this conversation going forward. And I do like that he kind of avoid. It's always a little bit frustrating where I'm like, oh, just tell us how to solve this problem. Tell us what to do about it. And some of these experts correctly are like, there's no one solution here. Here's what we need. We need people to be knowledgeable, and we need people to be invested and want to have these conversations at the local levels, the state levels, the federal levels. And the more that we're doing that, the more likely it is that we have outcomes that are sustainable, whether for AI and energy usage or for climate change. And I think I appreciate that, which is ultimately why I wanted to have this conversation to start with. So touche, Joe. You took me back to where I started.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like this idea of thinking about a holistic approach to this problem or really any problem. Like I feel like too often you hear with anything like someone's like singular view of like what the AI is the greatest thing that ever happened. It's going to revolutionize the blah 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 and blah blah, and then you never hear about like, well, yes, but in order to get there, we have to do X, Y, Z, or even on the flip side, right? The environmental like AI is going to use a ton of energy. It's going to be the worst thing ever, and it's going to destroy the world. And really, I think we know that is now becoming and is a fact of our lives, and so the most rational thing to do is like to consider all of the pros and the cons and how to do it with all of that in mind in the most, like you said, sustainable way, the way that you can like do it and not sort of upend all of the good things that we have kind of figured out, but also be able to realize some of the benefits that AI kind of promises. I loved the I just think that it's going to be an enormous challenge. And obviously, I've disclaimed this before that I am in some ways in the belly of the beast on this stuff, working on energy supply systems for data centers. And so, it was really interesting for me to hear kind of what questions you had because, like he was saying, like sometimes I get into a conversation with my own blinders on, like these are all the things that I know, and so I take a lot of them for granted. And to hear kind of some of your questions around like what you were thinking about, like, oh, I didn't really even understand or I wasn't really making that connection between energy and AI and really like that's all that I think about so that's all that I kind of I take that as a given but the sort of the population at large is maybe not making that connection but it's important to do that in an interesting way and I thought also what you mentioned about where these data centers are popping up is also like a really interesting one. I think it's it feels like one of those few areas of like real growth in the United States in a way that like manufacturing has always been on the down. Like we've kind of had a couple more like auto plants, but really it's just like moving around. Things have gone from Detroit down to South Carolina or whatever, right? Now you're seeing because of access to energy and or water or whatever land, whatever it is that data centers need, all of a sudden you're seeing this kind of growth pop up in areas that you hadn't before. And what Professor Keller's point was around like just like hoping that, hey, some of these communities are gonna bear the environmental costs like far more than others. Like, will they also reap the economic benefits in terms of increased jobs, in terms of, I mean, tax revenue is massive, right? Like in some of these states, there'll be state-based taxes that the data centers will pay, but will those revenues go back to the communities or will they get spread around the entire state? I think these are things that are going to be very interesting to follow and really necessary for policymakers to keep in mind that like let's not approach this as a this is all evil or this is all good, but it has the potential to do both good and bad. Like how do we make sure that we're like equitable in the treatment? So yeah, it was fascinating discussion. I'm really glad you found the article and brought him on.
Yeah, I learned a lot. So thanks for giving me the runway and space to ask my questions here.
Yeah, I mean, I learned a lot from you learning a lot, so we all learned.
Look at us.
All right, I suppose we can leave it there. Till next time.
I'll see ya.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though we did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.